Okay, we'll get started right now. I'm Steve Hunegs. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakota, and this is our third living room webinar. Our first was with Neil Kashkari, President of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, along with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. We then had Ambassador Extraordinaire Dennis Ross, and today we have Lori Sturdevant. Hello, Lori.
Hello,
Lori,
Steve.
as you probably well know, has been a legend in Minnesota journalism. She's covered Minnesota politics, Minnesota government, all things Minnesota across 5 decades. First as a political reporter, then as an editorial writer, and seemingly always as a prolific author too. So she's written much, she knows much, and we will continue our conversation with her. I'm joined today, it's a joint enterprise, with Dr. Elisia Cohen, who is the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. Welcome, Elisia. How wonderful that we can partner with the university and the Hubbard School for this grand occasion of the interviewing of Lori Sturdevant. Absolutely perfect. Here's our format, friends. We'll start with a few questions from Elisia. COVID-19 journalism, how recovery matters in this time. Then I'm going to ask some more general questions of Lori, maybe about her career, maybe some of the trends that she's seen across these generations, and a little bit about how we might conduct the 2020 elections, given the reality of COVID-19. About 1:10 or so, we'll move to Q&A, over which Dr. Cohen will preside. Thank you, Elisia. And then we'll conclude. I want to say just a quick word of thanks to all of our first responders, our medical personnel, everybody in Minnesota who's doing, and around the country and around the world, conducting their missions of mercy on behalf of all who are ill and on behalf of all of us. So we're just beyond the month in which we had the confluence of Passover, Easter, and we're in Ramadan right now. So there's something that's very poetic and fitting that the three monotheistic faiths should come together at this time. Dr. Cohen, Elisia, if you get us started with the first few questions, I'd be greatly honored. Thank you.
Sure. And I wanted just to thank you all for the invitation of the JCRC to co-host this conversation. We're always delighted to partner with community organizations to talk about issues relevant to our students, faculty, and alumni on questions related to the role of journalism and media in our democracy. And so I look forward to asking Lori here a few questions on those notes. So Lori, you were a columnist and opinion writer for many years, covering a range of significant historical events and governors and legislators. You're also a bit of a Minnesota political historian. Can you talk about the contours of the current political moment for columnists? What are columnists?
Well, Elisia, thank you for that good question, which I'll ponder a bit while I also offer my thanks to the JCRC for your leadership now and through many, many years. And thank you to the Hubbard School as well, a place where I once hung out in Murphy Hall long ago, and that I continue to look to for leadership for my profession through many years. So this is a big story, no question about it. And journalists are fully engaged in poking at this story from many angles. I think it's fitting and telling that when Governor Walz first issued his orders concerning who should stay home and who should go to work, news media, news organizations, journalists were on the list of essential workers. That's how important this is at this time. I'm a retired editorial writer now, retired in December of 2018. And so I'm not in the newsroom on a daily basis. I still write about 1 column a month. And so I can speak for myself and tell you that I'm looking to how we are preserving what we need to preserve, that things that have made Minnesota great, like our high participation in elections. I'm looking to seize onto opportunities for positive permanent change. So the column previous to this most recent one was about whether a shift to more telework might be a good thing environmentally and for our lifestyle, for our business community in Minnesota. Those sorts of things are what I'm trying to lift up as I think about this moment. But oh my goodness, there are so many stories to tell.
Lori, can you talk a little bit for our audience about what makes journalists essential workers during this period? I'm sure that you have an opinion and perspective on that they may be interested in hearing.
Well, this is such a moment for public health, for the importance of public health as part of our joint enterprise, what we owe each other in our civilization, in our society, is preserving, shoring up public health, and that public information, reliable, complete, as accurate as possible, public information goes hand in hand with public health. Many years ago, I actually thought that my professional career might lean more towards science journalism. And I'll tell you that part of what drew me in that direction in those years was the notion that I could contribute to the public understanding, through public information that would shore up our public health. It strikes me that at this time, at this moment in our shared life in the United States, we are approaching a public health crisis, having allowed some of that public health infrastructure to erode, having diminished our shared public information infrastructure. And we're missing that now. We're allowing some detrimental information and rumors to circulate in a way that could actually harm individuals' health. All the more reason why this is a moment for journalism to be lifted up and to be held in some esteem, I think.
One of the tools that journalists have is the ability to ask questions to people in positions of power and authority. What are the challenges, do you think, to either reporting or even to getting good information in a situation like COVID-19?
Well, I think it's plenty challenging when for many years, I was a legislative reporter, and I just couldn't imagine covering the legislature without being at the Capitol with the legislators and the lobbyists and the citizens who come to make their pleas. This is a challenging moment to not be able in a regular, in a more conventional way, in a more spontaneous way, to encounter your sources and engage in those conversations that are illuminating and that can tip you off to something that's coming that's of importance. All those conversations. It's a difficult environment. It also, though, I'm trying to think what are some of the positives. I think Minnesotans, through the daily briefings that happen at 2 o'clock, which is really one of the only ways sometimes reporters are able to get information, the public is able to watch our journalists in action. And I think they've put on a very impressive performance. I think that Minnesotans have come away from observing those daily briefings pleased not only with the knowledge and capability and intentions of our commissioners and of our elected leaders, but also of the journalists who are asking probing questions from a variety of dimensions and angles. I think it's been a good show.
One of the challenges during a moment like this, even during a war when covering difficult conflict or crisis situations, is that those in power often control a lot of the information resources. And there's really asymmetry between government officials and news organizations and journalists or columnists or others who are seeking that. So when you kind of think about the public health information that's out here today compared to other past political public health moments, whether it be the Minnesota measles epidemic or other types of really public health crises, what's markedly different, do you think, about the coverage in the moment today? What's the same, maybe?
Well, and here again, I'm a retired journalist, so I'm not doing the daily coverage right now. And so I speak with a bit of detachment there. But again, I would point to the fact that we are really more dependent at this moment than we would be in another situation on the official press conferences and what the officials are telling us. We are able to ask questions and probe at that. Certainly, try to seek out other information. But the information that comes from casual encounters with lots of people in one building, as we had for so many years at the state capitol, that's gone, and that's a felt loss, I think, for journalism. The only thing I can liken it to in my recent past of coverage was what it was like in the 2016 legislative session when the Capitol was essentially closed down for repairs. The Minnesota House continued to meet in its chamber, but everything else was off in other buildings. Now, all buildings close at hand, no question about it. But that was a difficult session, in part because of the scattered nature of what was going on. Difficult for us to cover as we were running 2 blocks away to the governor's office and then back up the hill. Difficult, I think, for legislators. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that the 2016 session ended badly with a bonding bill that collapsed in the last 5 minutes before midnight on a Sunday night. That, I think, might not have happened if people had better communication that comes from being in the same building. Well, we're not in the same building now, that's for sure. So that does interfere with coverage.
When you are reading right now as an armchair journalist and also just a member of the public, you know, what journalism are you enjoying, and what coverage are you finding of COVID-19 and also the legislature to be particularly compelling?
Oh, I have to give a shout out to those big national newspapers right now. I think that actually in the last several years, the New York Times and the Washington Post have served this country exceedingly well. People often ask me when I'm out speaking to groups about various books or other projects, well, what do I recommend? And I say, gee, folks, it sounds self-serving from someone who spent 43 years at the Star Tribune, but stick with newspapers. The quality of newspaper coverage is really strong. The newsrooms are large. They are truly independent. Let me just also though say a good word for some of the local journalism, which is right now under rather serious financial distress. Now, that's not to say that the big papers aren't suffering too. And if you're not paying for your stories that you're reading on the big newspapers, please, folks, consider paying for journalism or it will go away. But when I say that about paying for journalism, I also mean little organizations like The Villager, local newspaper based in the Highland Park neighborhood of St. Paul, which is right now, for the first time, beginning to move to a subscription model because it can't make it on just advertising revenue any longer. And there's a real question whether the subscription model will work for a paper that has been free for all of its history. And that's just one example of all around the country, local journalism that was very advertiser dependent being stressed right now. We need that journalism. And so I hope that people will understand that and will respond in a way that keeps that journalism alive.
It was so much of the pleasure, and Elisia, I hope you'll continue in the conversation too, is we can sit here today with you, Lori, and look at a vast career and thankfully ongoing career in journalism. And I want to splice into my questions and commentary when you retired, such as your retirement is. Yeah. Scott Gillespie wrote a piece, Star Tribune, in the editorial page, and I happened to read it, and I noticed some of the comments that people wrote. And I just want to start with this one because I think in many ways it's the essence of Lori Sturdevant. She said, this person wrote, "We don't agree politically, but I respect your writings in fairness. I respect your writings in fairness." And of course, that is the essence of journalism, is fairness. Just a thought as we frame our conversation with our distinguished dean of the Hubbard School and you after 43 years of journalism. But I want to go back a little bit in time because so many of us love history and Minnesota history and the like. And I brought a couple artifacts to help the first question. One was here, it's just 1964 official inaugural program, actually my birthday, January 20, 1965, from the day that Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey were inaugurated as president and vice president of the United States. And another old-time favorite, the old classic Wendy Anderson on the cover of Time magazine, holding his Northern Pike, and actually at one point autographed to me too. But there's a broader point here, and that is, at one time, Minnesota was a Republican state. Another time, Minnesota was a Democratic state. I happen to hold up the artifacts from maybe that era of when the Democrats dominated in Minnesota, roughly 50s through the 70s. The first race you covered as a political reporter was the watershed election of 1978, when the Republicans dominated. They won both Senate seats and they won the governorship, remarkably. How about some memories of that election for us?
It was probably because that election was such a big deal with those 3 big statewide races, 2 Senate seats and a governorship on the ballot. We had that again in 2018, but that was the first time it had happened again since 1978. That was such a big deal that the newsroom was looking around for help for the political team. And I had been the religion reporter who had been at the who had covered, among other things, the JCRC or its predecessor organization. But I had been at the Capitol a few times because the spillover between the religion beat and the abortion issue was bringing me to the Capitol. The hot button of the abortion issue was really sort of one of my entrees into being a political reporter. And the other thing was that they just simply, the newsroom needed help. And so they asked the girl reporter, I was 25 years old that year, to please go off and cover Al Quie. I think they picked Al Quie because the editors didn't think he would win, but he did. And because he did, and because I was the Al Quie expert then in the newsroom, I was dispatched to the Capitol full-time for the 1979 session. And they said, oh, we're tired of covering this stadium issue. We'll give this to the girl reporter. And none of us like to write about workers' comp, and that's a dull issue. We'll give her workers' comp and the stadium issue, both of which turned out to be central issues through the whole session and became big deals at the end of that session. So I was well served by the 1978 election.
A great story. So we talked about the transitions that you've seen. You used the phrase girl reporter.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there was a certain amount of sexism. Is that what you're suggesting in journalism?
Well, yes, I think there was. And I think that some of the boy reporters were not excited to welcome a woman to their little enclave in the basement of the Capitol. And it was a very male-dominated enclave then, though I don't think I was the first woman. I think Betty Wilson preceded me by a couple of years at the Minneapolis Star. And I think by then, Marcia Fleur was there. And she was then with Channel 5. Soon thereafter came Karen Boros to Channel 4. So there began to be a few of us, and we found each other quickly and became fast friends still to this day. But yeah, there was a sense that the females were here to write the soft, puffy feature stories or to do the dirty work with beats and assignments that the boys didn't like, hence I got the stadium issue and the workers' comp issue. And that the boys would do the real stories. But you know, it didn't always work out that way. And I think that those of us who wore skirts to the Capitol proved our worth.
Got it. It's interesting. Maybe there's a parallel. You started mentioning Karen Boros, Marcia Fleur, Betty Wilson, of course yourself. You know, Minnesota, we'd had a bit of a history of elected women. We had Koya Knudsen, right? If she's elected,
well, that's quite a story, though. Yeah.
That's quite the story.
Yeah.
And then Eugenie Anderson was an ambassador to Denmark as well.
Never elected. Never elected, but yes, really a prominent person in the DFL.
So here and there, females, women were rising, as in journalism. I mean, what do you think ultimately either journalism or politics helped thoroughly open the door for female participation in the political life of Minnesota?
Well, I always thought that I was lucky to have been in journalism at the time that I was, because I was just a few years after some of the real pioneers had opened doors for women. For example, just a few years before I came to the paper, the first maternity leave, parenting leave policies were created so that women could have children and then continue their careers, which was a breakthrough. So journalism became a good career for women in the mid-1970s and beyond. And it was also a time of increasing participation for women in politics. I like to talk about the 1972 election in Minnesota as the breakthrough election. We went from having one woman in the legislature in 1971 to 6, all in the Minnesota House in 1973. And the names of some of those elected will be names you'll recognize, like Phyllis Kahn and Joan Grow and Linda Berglund are among the 6 women who sat in those legislative seats in 1973. And those numbers continue to increase as, I think, a marker for what was happening in lots of fields at that time. Doors were really beginning to open. Rosalie Wall, who was someone I wrote about, graduated from law school in 1967 with 2 women in her class at William Mitchell College of Law. By the time her daughter was a student at the same school about a decade later, there was about 40% female, and within a short while, more than 50% female. So just in that period, we were really seeing an explosion of change for women. Gail Collins from the New York Times has written a book about this very phenomenon, saying it's hard to point to one or two causes. It was a society-wide breakthrough pushed by economics and culture in a variety of ways, but I was lucky to be part of that wave of opportunity for women in the 1970s and 80s.
Thank you, Lori, and I'm glad you mentioned the late and distinguished Rosalie Wall, because you wrote the book as you reference her honor, Rosalie Wall and the Minnesota women's movement. So obviously you were connecting in your book her ascendancy to the Minnesota Supreme Court, sort of dash, bitter election in 1978, dash.
Yeah, really was.
And the advancement of women in general in Minnesota. I'll make this point, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about Justice Wall, because she's such a fascinating person. That we now have, of course, a female Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, Lori Sturdevant, and now, as of a couple of weeks ago, appointed Susan Siegel as the Chief Judge of the Minnesota Court of Appeals. So now, I'm not sure, perhaps this is reflected in some other state in the country, but I know certainly we're at a unique moment in Minnesota history where both Chief Justices of our appellate courts are women. Comment, please.
Oh, and I'm excited about that appointment, partly because I consider Susan such a close personal friend for so many years. Richly deserved appointment. But Rudy Perpich took great pride in not only appointing the first female to the state's high court, that was Rosalie in 1977 when Rudy was governor the first time. But then he created the first female majority, 4-3 female majority on the Minnesota Supreme Court, and he did so on his very last day in office in January of 1991. That was a big point of pride for him. And then as retirements happened and other changes, that female majority was lost, I think sometime in the mid-90s. Rosalie retired in 1994. Then when Mark Dayton became governor, and he was paying close attention to the gender situation. And I remember being at a press conference when Governor Dayton was announcing a female appointment to the court. I think it was the Ann McKeague appointment. And he made a point to come over to me and whisper in my ear, "Notice, it's a female majority court again." He was so proud of that. He considered Rudy Perpich a mentor, and he knew how important that was to Rudy, and he was so glad to bring that female majority back. At the time in 1991, when Rudy did that, we were the only high court in the country to have a female majority. Michigan followed us soon thereafter. We may indeed be the only court now in the country to have 2 female chiefs, the Susan Siegel appointment and the Lori Sturdevant position. So that's exciting for those of us who believe that justice, the administration of justice should look like the rest of the population. It builds trust and confidence that this is a truly representative, a part of government. And I like to see that happen.
Sure. We have, on a more somber note, we have the 100th anniversary of the Duluth lynchings of Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee. And that was to be commemorated June 15, 2020, which is the exact date 100 years later of the lynching. I'm part of a group, CLCC, Judge Jack Thunheim, the Chief Judge of the Federal District Court of Minnesota, organizing in connection with the Duluth Committee, all sorts of activities and commemorations. And Brian Stevenson was to be, Just Mercy was to be the speaker, hopefully will be again in 2021 when the commemoration again is online and on track. But you talk about advancement of women. What have you seen over the years in terms of minority participation in politics in Minnesota, diversity and the like? Because of course, that's been an ongoing story. We all know the role of Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale and the like, and many, Elmer Anderson, in the advancement of civil rights in Minnesota. You've written a book about Governor Anderson. But what have you seen and where are we going?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the work you're doing on that 100th anniversary in Duluth. That's the kind of civic black eye that many communities around the country would just as soon forget and not commemorate. And yet we I think, do well to remember what really happened there and to understand how that could have happened as far away as Duluth, Minnesota. My daughter visited Brian Stevenson's, is it a museum down in Montgomery, Alabama? And she did that just a few months ago and sent me in horror the display there about the Duluth lynching, realizing that Minnesota was was being held up that way, so that it's clear that the problem was not just confined to the South. Racism was an endemic thing in this country, and it's all of our responsibilities to root it out. As for Minnesota's record on civil rights and political participation, I'd have to say it's a little bit mixed. We like to congratulate ourselves for being a year ahead of the federal Constitution. Back in 1868, Minnesota agreed to grant suffrage to Black male voters, a year ahead of the national amendment, 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But we shouldn't congratulate ourselves too much. It took us 3 tries to get that amendment passed, and it did not include Native Americans, who were not granted the right to vote, I don't think, until 1924, and that was federal action, not Minnesota action. So our record is not as good as it might be. We had Black legislators elected in the 1970s and 80s, not in big numbers. We've had a better success in recent years with electing people of color, but then our population of people of color has been growing. I do point out to folks, because people who are new to Minnesota might not know what our demographic trends have been in this state. This state had a very small population of color until about the 1990s. It was in single digits. And that's, we had a lot of demographic change in Minnesota. I'm sorry to say that I think our political representation has been a lagging rather than a leading indicator of that. But I think that there has been some recent progress that is worth encouraging.
Thank you. I don't want to monopolize this conversation, even though we said that we would turn it over to Elisia for Q&A. Maybe Elisia wants to ask a question about COVID-19 and how we're going to conduct our elections, and maybe from 2 journalists can talk about that right now.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's a question that that a lot of people have in mind. So Steve asked it first, and I'll just follow up in rephrasing. When you think about the challenges ahead in the fall for covering our free and fair and open election, as well as issues related to mail-in voting, there's all sorts of potential reforms in the air. How do you think that journalists should be approaching the issue, and then how do you think members of the public should be approaching politicians right now? I mean, we have some advocacy that we can do on our own as well in terms of what we want to see for fall, perhaps.
Well, just as we do for so many things, we are turning to our devices, our internet connectivity, to help us know what's going on in all kinds of realms, politics included. And I'd like to think that may give all of us actually some enhanced opportunities to follow the daily pronouncements of our politicians and to assess the performances of our leaders in maybe a more video-centric way than we have in the past. There is all of that, but I have to use this springboard to give a pitch to a new book that I've got coming out. That's with Joan Grow, our former Secretary of State. The title of the book is Turnout: Making Minnesota the State That Votes. And that will come out in August in connection with the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in this country. And it's a time for us the book is an opportunity for Joan and I and others who care about voter participation to really lift this up. I think the willingness, the desire to vote and to participate in our shared life in this way is a characteristic of Minnesota that we need to lift up and enhance and cling to right now. So many of us feel that a virus has taken control of our lives. This is a chance through voting for us to assert some control over something that really is rightfully ours to control, our representative democracy. Minnesota has had the highest voter turnout in 9 of the last 11 presidential elections, and it's probably more than that, but that's as far back as they kept records. So we have a strong tradition of voting in big numbers in presidential elections. And already Minnesotans have been approaching me, of all people, to say, how do I get an absentee ballot and how do I vote by mail? Or get an absentee ballot that I can deliver myself to a polling place in plenty of time on my own schedule when there isn't a crowd. People are thinking about, how do I vote in the time of this pandemic? I hope legislators are also thinking about how can we help Minnesotans vote at this time of pandemic. There is federal money to be had for this purpose. But in Minnesota, the legislature must free up that federal money for it to flow to the local elections officials. That's a must in this legislative session.
Thanks so much, Lori. Steve, did you have another question?
Sure. Lori, you mentioned Joan Grow. Your previous book was about David Dernberger and the progressive Republican tradition of Minnesota, which I dare say also contained a strong internationalist component. That is, Minnesota via the United States and vice versa should be a player on the platform of global affairs. I sent you sort of the dubious privilege of reading a little essay that I'd written based upon the serialization by, I believe it was HBO, of Plot Against America, in which I discussed sort of Lindbergh and Wilkie, FDR, and the politics and the emotions of the time, particularly the run-up to the 1940 presidential election. But a point I was making in that essay, back here in Minnesota, your newspaper, or the relative of the newspaper through the Coles family, was a very strong internationalist newspaper, and that Des Moines Register too. And that was very much connected to that portion of the spirit of East Coast Republicanism, some portions of Midwest Republicanism that was more globally viewed. It's kind of an awkward question, but sort of wrap this up for us together when this really important strain of internationalism is and was part of the Republican Party, right?
Well, I would submit that that internationalism is one part of the departure that Harold Stassen brought to the Minnesota Republican Party when he emerges as this strong force and is elected governor at age 32, I think it was, 31 and 32 in 1938. The Republican Party in Minnesota then and again now, it was a reflection of the National Republican Party. And there had been in Minnesota Republican tradition, there'd been a bit of a populist undertow. Charles Lindbergh's father represented some of that, and he eventually breaks, I think, with the Republican Party. But mostly it was a laissez-faire party and had a strong isolationist bent. But here comes Harold Stassen and some other younger folks through a very active Young Republican League that Harold helped build that had a very different view. And this was divisive stuff in this state. I know that because of my work with the Pillsbury family on a book called The Pillsburys of Minnesota that was published in 2011. John S. Pillsbury, the eldest son of that family, of that generation, graduated from Yale in 1935, and he was a strong backer of what Lindbergh was saying. He was helping to fund Lindbergh. He was an isolationist of some note with a name like Pillsbury. His youngest of several brothers, George, my good friend, who was the state senator of Minnesota, strongly for Stassen, strongly an internationalist, strongly opposed to what Lindbergh was saying. The family fights at the dinner table at Thanksgiving in 1940 were pretty heated, I understand, because of that split in that family. And I think that family is illustrative of a split that was happening in Minnesota at that time. We had careers in Minnesota politics rise and fall over this split over isolationism versus internationalism in that 1940 and 41 period. I think FDR did carry Minnesota. FDR did well in Minnesota in that year, but Wilkie had a following in 1940 election, and it's, I think, notable that Phil Wilkie, his grandson, lives in Minnesota to this day and is a force here locally. So Wilkie, of course, comes around to a more internationalist view, but it took him a while, and that was a factor in that election. It's a fascinating time to study and well worth studying right now, I think, because of the parallels to what we see going on today.
I don't think I'm speaking out of Phil, but after I wrote a piece about Lindbergh for the Star Tribune, I get an email from Phil. Never met him before. And he says, "Thanks for writing that piece. My family always disliked that SOB Lindbergh."
Well,
of course, a very complicated personality. I grant that I'm not trying to summarize Charles Lindbergh's life in one sentence, other than this sort of smile about the comment. But it's to say the least, it's a complicated legacy.
It really is. I was a very close friend with Elmer Anderson, who was 18 years old the day that Lucky Lindy flew across the Atlantic. And I think my friend Elmer was caught up in the hero worship that swept the country, among young Americans especially. And so Lindbergh had that advantage of celebrity that Minnesotans have shown a weakness for many times in both parties. Think about all the former entertainment and sports celebrities that have wound up in positions of political responsibility in this state. Lindbergh, the book that you referenced speculated, I think it was the Philip Roth book, speculated about what would happen if Lindbergh had won the presidency. And indeed, politically, that would not have been possible for him. By 1940, November, he was already not doing so well. But had he run for governor in Minnesota? I don't know. Had he taken on Harold Stassen? I don't know.
Great. Well, Wendell Willkie is one of my great heroes in life, and I can see, I don't want to stand up, but I'm in the middle of our conversation here, the irrepressible Wendell Willkie, which is the relatively new biography of him by David Leverine Lewis. I think I'm getting the name right. I should know it. I'm reading the book, but what a remarkable person he was. And FDR knew he had his hands full with Willkie in the 1940 race. Simultaneously, he was somewhat relieved because he also appreciated the fact that Willkie was not an appeaser and understood the fundamentally evil nature of Nazi Germany, which was manifest for all to see. So he appreciated that he had a really tough opponent on his hands, but he also took some comfort in knowing that he would probably champion a strong American response to Hitler and Hitler's domination of Europe. But I have before me two experts in communication, as we all know, you in your career in journalism in the newspaper, and Dr. Cohen in journalism, teaching young journalists. I'd like to hear both of you talk about together what it is that you should teach aspiring journalists now. What should aspiring journalists know, and how can the dean of the Hubbard School and someone who's a lifelong journalist sort of collaborate to help train our next generation of journalists?
I think this question picks up, and maybe we can help answer Heather Ring's question to us, which is really, what is the role of and responsibility of journalism and journalists to establish a new normal of thoughtful, respectful discourse, but a clear understanding of the state of the world, is what she says, that will allow us to thoughtfully analyze and collectively address truly worldwide problems, such as COVID-19. This is something I've been thinking about for a few years, particularly as we've heard more about fake news and concerns over facts. And the truth is that the fundamentals of journalism haven't changed at all. And we have always been a profession that has clear norms and ethics, professional standards, and that's been convoluted in some ways. So what some people, so I think educating the public about what ethical journalism looks like, about what it means to cover facts, to verify sources, to be clear and transparent in research and work, to tell stories with accuracy, is part of our collective responsibility. We teach our students to ask good questions. One of our famous quote from one of our faculty in the school, Chris Eisen, he says, stories with one source suck, stories with two sources kind of suck. Stories with three sources suck a little less. In other words, the more kind of sources, the more that we can kind of get at, and I just butchered what he actually says, but it's something like that, the more that we can triangulate the facts and start uncovering and sifting through the truth. And so when we have big social problems like climate change, like COVID-19, we need to figure out what is expert opinion, what is settled scientific fact, and what is not. And where there is not settled agreement, then there is reasonable debate about what policy should be, normative questions about the day. That's why we have great columnists and other people to weigh in. But good journalism reports on the facts and provides insight into that aspect of the world. Lori, what would you say?
Well, thank you for that. That's very well said. I don't talk to student journalists very often, but when I do get that chance, I like to lift up two things. One is to stay curious, and it's easy in the day-to-day grind of journalism to allow your curiosity to dull a bit. Stay curious amounts to keep asking questions. asking questions both of the experts and of the critics of the experts. And so that's one thing I lift up. The other thing is something that Eric Escala said to me years ago. Eric Escala, long of WCCO Radio in the basement, now a TPT Almanac. He said, you know, we people who reside in the Capitol basement, that's where the Capitol press room is, we're the least cynical people in this building. I want that to be true. I want that to still be true. I want those of us who are journalists to not be cynical about what it is that people are trying to do and why it is that people come to the state capitol seeking relief of grievances or assistance with problems or seeking to celebrate, whatever the reason may be. I'd like us to not approach our work with cynicism. And I guess both of these comments involve how to do journalism for the long haul and not be jaded. Some people think journalism is a nice place to start, but not something you wouldn't want to stick with. That journalism is one of those things that you do for a few years and then you go off and make real money. And it's of concern to me that some journalists are paid so poorly that they really need to go off to make real money to support their families. That shouldn't be, because there is something to be said for institutional memory, something to be said for those sources that go very deep, something to be said for sticking with this enterprise and understanding its role in the larger society. And I think that understanding only grows with a commitment over time. So those would be the things I would lift up.
That's the other thing that occurs to me is I always talk, and when I had to interview for the journalism school director position, I think that there is a tendency in the industry, because of the challenges particularly faced by newspapers and the economic changes and challenges in the industry, to be cynical about the future of news gathering. But the truth is we have more outlets, more types of journalism than ever before, more ability to tell stories that matter. I think about all of the stories that have grown nonprofit outlets as well around our current immigration crisis in society, and the number of new voices that are being heard in ways that might not have been imagined 50 years ago in US journalism. And so I think that it's important to stay optimistic about the way that technology and different changes will shift. Our journalism may look a little different, but the power and importance of telling stories is still important. Another question that we have here is, how does the populace's interest in journalism, this is from Ian Nemerov, how does the populace's interest in journalism return to wanting to be informed instead of being entertained or reaffirmed? So.
That's a good question, and that's something I've been puzzling over a lot lately, actually. It seems like a lot of what has caused people to be dissatisfied with journalism stems in large measure from the willingness of some news providers to use the tools, overuse, I would say, the tools of entertainment to build their audience, to seek to amass a loyal audience through tools like anger and fear and outrage and emotional kinds of appeals, rather than the appeal of trying to present relevant information that serve the shared life of the whole community, which is more the old journalism model that I adhere to at the Star Tribune. I wish I had a good answer for how we encourage folks to tamp down their appetite for those outrage-inducing information sources. That style is being used because it works in amassing an audience, not a broad audience, but certainly a loyal niche audience. That's been the business model that has made talk radio flourish for 30 years in this country, and that is at the root of our most prominent cable news organizations. It's a very different business model from that newspapers relied on, and we are kind of seeing one in decline and the other one still seemingly on the increase in this country. I would like to think that the ubiquity of the sources that you describe, the new sources of journalism that are appearing, and that our experience as a country as we deal with something like the COVID crisis, is maybe sobering us up a little bit, causing us to rethink the need for reliable information that's delivered in a broad-based way and that is not intended to just push your emotional buttons? I'd like to think that. I don't know. Try to think hopeful thoughts.
It's interesting as when I was in graduate school, and the social scientists who study the differences in factual content between an infotainment or entertainment programs and news have reached interesting conclusions. For example, The Daily Show, which I remember one faculty member of mine thought was one of the worst things that happened to news, and as infotainment as well as entertainment. There was some evidence that The Daily Show contained more facts about political stories than some coverage that was seen on Fox News during the same period. There were some studies that kind of supported that piece at the same. So it's possible to be both entertained and informed with facts, and it's possible that some people who tell stories with information might not be presenting facts fully. So we need a new literacy and to do a better job at training people in this information environment. I personally am hopeful. My daughter is young enough that she is watching CNN 10 at school and has a sense of what facts are and evidence are, and is being trained in a way that I think the generation before her was not, and in a different way that my generation, obviously, of cynics perhaps was as well. So I think that these issues ebb and flow. I think that what we do need is a reservoir of reliable factual information about politics, and we need citizens who are well equipped to ask good questions and to think critically about the sources and information that we have. We have real problems with misinformation, and even worse, disinformation, which is the kind of propaganda that is out there. It's one thing to simply be misinformed. It's another thing to be deliberately dissuaded for political ends and purposes.
If I can just add one thing, a lot of people ask about journalism education and how we bring up the next generation of journalists with the kind of values that would serve the broad community. And that's not to diminish the importance of all that. But I think it is really important in this environment that citizenship education, the education that all of us have about civics, include a better understanding about how to be discerning consumers of this information fire hose that is now shot at every citizen in this country. That piece is, I think, exists in some settings, less so in others, and that's very important.
We have a related question from Holly Farber that is wondering about the consumption of journalism online and whether that creates bias, confirming information bubbles or filter bubbles as well. Are readers more or less sophisticated now than they were before the internet? I don't know that it's a sophistication issue. There's a lot of research by my colleagues in political psychology who say that around the issue of motivated reasoning. And so what ends up happening is, even if people are exposed to different information, their motivated reasoning, their psychology in terms of how they approach and actually filter the facts within the stories confirms biases. So it even just raw exposure to broader sources of information won't help with disconfirming, won't help people get over it. And so what researchers really around the country are looking at is this question of how do we work with people's own biases to help people understand their motivated reasoning and kind of self-inoculate in some ways against biases. And I don't know if you've been reading anything like that at all, but I think that it's not just consumption of journalism online, it's really just how people approach the diversity of information sources. Two people can read the same story, have different starting places, and come away with a different view of the world, and based on their the schema that they have in their head is one of the concerns that we see.
No, I think that's absolutely right. The book that I read recently that left me depressed about all this is called Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein, the writer for Politico, I think formerly Washington Post. And it's mostly a psychology book. And human psychology is really wired to lapse into these us versus them dichotomies and choose up sides and crack it. And there are people who have made a lot of money doing that to Americans. And what I would like to see, and maybe journalism has a role, people in my part of journalism, the opinion side of journalism have a role to play in helping people to see that their tribe, the us, isn't just their political party, it's the whole country, the whole planet, it's humanity. To allow us to think bigger and define ourselves in those broader terms. The call to do that is really central, I think, to your faith and mine, and it's an exercise not just for journalism but also for faith leadership, but to get us to understand a broader connection so that we define ourselves not just as narrow tribes, but as part of all of humanity. I think is really one of the challenges for this century and beyond.
I think that
I was going to say, Elisia, if that's 1 second, maybe take this moment with these two pillars of Minnesota journalism, Dr. Cohen, Lori Sturdevant, to pay a moment of homage to our journalism pedigree of the state. And I think of people like Eric Seberide. And then sort of this remarkable connection. You mentioned the New York Times, Lori, for practically half century with a little bit of time in between. First, you had Harrison Salisbury from Minneapolis, member of my grandma, Gladys Dobrin's high school class at North High, believe it or not, 1824, who later went on to become, of course, maybe the foremost foreign affairs correspondent for the New York Times for decades. He wrote the leading English language account of the siege of Leningrad, 900 days. And then not too long later, Tom Friedman, in a way, sort of assumes his platform on the New York Times. So think about it. Maybe something about Minnesota exceptionalism, even though we know that that's a somewhat topic which we can discuss for years. But this huge contribution of Minnesotans to journalism at the highest international levels is something that's remarkable. And I think the Hubbard School at the university and Lori and all your work over the years, and we have so much for which to be proud as Minnesotans and people in the upper Midwest of what we've been able to contribute. So that was my little, what we call Devar Torah or homily to Minnesota journalists. And I just wanted to mention it. So there you have it. Maybe a reflection from both of you here at the end about journalism and its importance. I see we're at 123 and we've done a great job of holding on to 90% of our audience, to which I attribute that to Elisia and Lori, but maybe a thought here or two in the end and we'll wrap up.
Lori, you want to go ahead?
Well, that's a nice remembrance of some pretty important names, none of which, as I thought about it, none of those three that you mentioned served time in the Capitol basement. But let me tell you that I'm a proud alumna of the Capitol Press Corps, and I feel that we have been well served in Minnesota by the caliber of journalism that has taken state government seriously and has wanted to write about it in a way, broadcast about it in a way that has engaged citizens and invited them to participate. I think that's been very important in keeping us connected. The challenge going forward will be, can we, in a challenging business environment in which these news organizations find themselves, can they maintain that strength of coverage? I have no doubt that the journalists now involved are committed professionals who will hold to professional values as long as they are able. But I fear that layoffs could be coming. I fear that we could be losing some of our most important and longest lived outlets if we don't have some economic recovery in the next year or so. So we are indeed in challenging times. And my appeal to your audience today would be, please pay for journalism. If you don't pay for journalism, it does go away.
I think I would add that Minnesota is exceptional. Our journalism school is almost 100 years old. We were one of the first accredited journalism schools in the country, which was accreditation occurred in order to help professionalize the industry, and it developed to develop ethical standards and standard training practices, and we still employ those today. I think there's a lot to be proud of here. It's one of the things that excited me when I moved to Minneapolis, certainly into St. Paul and this broader community throughout the state. The state has a terrific media industry of small papers, small media outlets, producers through, throughout the state and throughout the region. Really has always been a leader. And I think that the role of, and the importance of journalism, the fact that we had a journalism school in the early days of the University of Minnesota, for example, has always been to educate citizens and to equip people with the skills of asking good questions, seeking the truth, looking at facts, thinking critically about social problems, and getting people to talk about these problems across different divisions. And so I think that when we look at a problem like COVID-19, to answer Russ Rubin's question before, the role of journalism in society is important, of sharing stories, not just of those who are powerful or who have more money or who are behind a brand or corporation, although those stories are important too, but it's also just individuals who make up the fabric of our society, of people who are frontline workers, who are employees, et cetera. And I'm just, our school is at the center of a civic readiness initiative that's being launched in our college. And then part of that is because we think that journalism, the skills that journalists teach, that is taught in a journalism school, is really important to equipping citizens with the tools that they need to participate broadly in civil society and in civic life. And I think there are many ways that people get educated in that, but journalism definitely has a set of tools and strategies that contribute to solving and to talking about those broader social problems. And I'm really proud of that. So
thank you. Thank you to Dr. Cohen, Elisia, for your leadership at the Hubbard School. It's hugely important to the integrity of the state, the information age, that we have one of the leading schools of journalism in the country here at the University of Minnesota. Lori, what can I say? You are a legend. That's why we use that title today. After all of these years of continued reporting, and we expect it to go on in your good health, and you're such a role model and heroine to so many, so thank you very much. Lori, a special thanks to the Star Tribune, DJ Tice and Scott Gillespie and my dear friend John Rashevo. It's been so very good to this JCRC and the pieces that we submit to the commentary page, and we always see it as one of the leading, most important, along with many other news outlets in the state, so we're very thankful to that. So thank you very much. I want to say thank you to my JCRC colleagues, Sammy, Anthony, Ethan, Ellen, who are all major players in the Living Room webinar series, but everybody on the JCRC staff and our board chair, Marty Chester, and our board of directors and our executive committee, and all of our supporters are working so very hard these days in the age of COVID-19, as are all my colleagues at the JCRC. And part of the reason we're here today is because we're trying to transform our JCRC programming into something that is safe at social distancing for the Zoom. But I want to thank everyone for participating, everyone who came aboard today, giving us your time. Thank you for your support. We look forward to further conversations. Our next Living Room webinar is with David Horowitz, speaking of journalism, founder of the Times of Israel website, and Sarah Tuttle Singer, on May 7th at 12:30. So I hope you'll join us for that installment. And I thank you, Dr. Cohen, Elisia, Lori, for your time today and all that you've done for all of us in Minnesota and beyond. Good afternoon.
Thank you.